Hello Venera, this is my feedback to your mock listening exam. Before I start talking about the paragraphs, let me note that you wrote good notes. In the final exam you should do the same, but we're not assessing the quality of the notes. The only thing we're assessing is how different your final notes are from the first notes. And yours are indeed different. You focus mostly on the evidence in your final notes and more on the supporting ideas in your first notes, which is fine. That's a way of making it quite different. If you want to make it even more different, more obviously different to the person grading your exam, you could just make the first notes more natural, more messy. Just take your first notes while you listen to the video for the first or second time. That will guarantee that your notes will not be very organized because that's a natural process. When you're listening to a lecture in real life and the speaker is talking fast, you probably do not have time to organize your thoughts and think while listening, while taking notes, that this is a supporting idea, that this is a main idea. You're just trying to scramble and get as much on the page as you can. And part of that process involves using abbreviations, all kinds of symbols, all sorts of things that would help you write faster and get as much of the information on the page as you can without necessarily thinking about organization. So your notes could be very messy. No problem, your first notes. Then, once you've discussed it with your peers, you can sit down and organize it in supporting ideas, in evidence, the way you've done. And this will guarantee that your final notes will be very obviously different than your first notes. Because that's the only thing we are grading, really. We're not grading the quality. Okay, now let's look at these paragraphs. They're all quite good, actually. I particularly liked your evidence paragraph, where it shows that you've really understood all the three categories. The evidence is not sufficient because you're saying you're giving a specific reason why lack of information, the evaluators, the quantity. In addition, it cannot be considered sufficient. You said the evidence is not sufficient, and then in addition it cannot be considered sufficient. Another reason why it's not sufficient is that the experiment is not compared and commented on by scientists. Yeah, so it doesn't have any scientific value. In order for a speaker to support such a generalized claim as he's making, you would need a lot more data, even metadata, specific examples, concrete data that has more scientific value. Okay, but I like your thinking here. You've done quite a good job with the sufficiency and with all the others as well. The evidence is somewhat relevant as it measures the correlation between procrastination and the creative process, trying to explain how originals think when they have a task in mind, but at the same time distancing to other things, distracting to other things, like playing a game. However, it is not clear why exactly this time period were taken for the experiment. Okay. How many and who were the participants, so that they could be more related to business people. Okay, so that they could be, yeah, so you're saying these participants, that's not necessarily relevant. Yeah, okay, so very good again. Sure. The only thing I would say here, I get what you're saying, it's just the phrasing is a little bit off. So you can work on the phrasing. So for instance here, it is not clear why exactly this time periods were taken, comma, how many and who were the participants, so that there could be more related to the business here, so that there could be more related to the business people. It's not very English, you know what I mean, the phrasing. But I understand what you're saying, and your thought process is actually quite good here. There is very little that I could improve on this paragraph, so just tighten up the phrasing and that's all you need to do. Finally, the evidence is not representative because it does not represent the real original thinkers nor the procrastinators. This is just one result in one situation, which would be different in one if one circumstance was changed. Okay, fine. Here we could expand a little bit more to show why this is not necessarily typical of the creative process, because the supporting idea here was that originals, their best ideas come while they're doing something else, while they're procrastinating. So you could say that that's not necessarily a typical representation of the creative process of original thinkers. We could probably come up with thousands of examples of creative thinkers who actually do not distract themselves from other tasks, from their tasks by doing other things, by procrastinating. So you could just go on a little bit more. Like you've done here, you've really explained this very well. So my only recommendation would be just expand on this, on the representativeness, a little bit more, just to prove that it indeed is not very typical, not necessarily typical of the creative process. Okay, now let's go to the summary. In his speech, okay, I would just include the title. Remember, you have to include the title in your first sentence, name of the speaker. Here, it's fine you use a good sentence structure and all that, but if you look at the rubric, you will see that the first sentence, on top of being argumentative, also has to be concise. And this is definitely not a concise first sentence. I don't think you need this. Just go straight to claims that. Plus, remember how we said we stay away from examples. And your summary is full of examples here. Right? These examples, all this evidence, numbers, evidence, examples, all these things, they are reserved for the identification and the evidence paragraph. In this one, we only talk about main idea and supporting ideas. And look, your example is right in the middle of your first sentence. So just take those out and focus on the supporting ideas. Now, obviously, if you throw these out, you will need to pad up because you have up to 200 words, and you can definitely do that. There's usually, we insist on 3 or 4 supporting ideas. That's what the rubric says. Go back to the rubric and see very carefully what we expect. And so you will basically be talking in the exam about 3 or 4 supporting ideas, or 5 at the most. If it's 3 like here, then you have a bit of space. So use that space to expand on the idea, but don't get into examples. Just explain a little bit more. There's usually something that can always be explained. Follow up. Once you've mentioned the idea, expand it in the next sentence. That's going to take you up to 200 words, but not using examples. Okay? So your main idea is claims that general expectations are not correct. Okay, fine. Yeah, I would take that. I would just be a little bit more precise because imagine somebody has not seen the video. Will they understand what the video is about just from this? The video is about the surprising habits of original thinkers, so that's what you can say. Claims that original thinkers often have surprising habits that we do not associate with successful people, or something like that. You could even talk about procrastination if you think that that's the main idea. You could say what looks like procrastination is actually a creative part of the creative process. Original thinkers, surprisingly, even though they look that they're procrastinating, actually the procrastination is part of their creative process. You can say that that's the main idea, right? But you see, that's a very targeted way of putting it. Okay. explains that originals are turned to be mostly, I'm not sure what this means, are turned to be mostly procrastinators, and the best ideas come to them while they are getting other things, they're doing other things than is necessary. Okay, fine. Sure. He continues with, now this is what you should avoid, right? Here, just focus on the fact that they may look like they're procrastinating, but really they're not. They're in the back of their mind, they're germinating new ideas. All of that is an important part of the creative process. You could always say something more, but only focusing on the idea, not on examples. Now here, this, you could even say that that's a whole separate supporting idea. If you want to treat it as a supporting idea, a different one, you can do that. Or you could just keep going like you've done with the first one, no problem. But I think this part, it does merit a whole separate sentence. So put a full stop somewhere after you've finished with the supporting idea without the example. You can put a full stop and go on and say, a lot of original thinkers are not necessarily, the speaker said, first movers. You don't have to use his term. You could just say, are not necessarily the first to come up with an idea or a product or a service. They often wait and see what's available on the market, and then they make improvements, original improvements to that idea, or creative improvements, however you want to put it. That was a kind of an important part of they're not just sitting and waiting and doing nothing. They're observing what's going on, and then they use an existing idea, product, or service that's already available on the market, and then they make an improvement. And that's what their originality consists of. So I could say something like that. This is what you're saying here right away. But this, if you have space, if you find yourself, you have a lot of space, and you can afford to explain this, I think you should, in a whole separate sentence, because that seemed to be like an important idea. And that goes back to previously in the semester we were talking about innovation versus invention a little bit. He also mentions that original thinkers may have doubts and fears. That's good. That's another good one. And then, now here, when you refer to him, either refer to him as Grant, both names, or the speaker. This sounds like you're his friend. Having brought the scheme of a creative process gives advice. Okay, you kind of like the ing here. I noticed you use that quite a lot, which is good. That's good writing. No problem. I wouldn't put that slap bang in the middle of the first sentence, but here it actually is very suitable. Having brought the scheme of a creative process gives advice to avoid self-doubt. Okay, nice. Which generally stops people from getting further. I like this, but it's a little vaguely stated. You can definitely work on the phrasing here. But yes, he's talking about self-doubt and how original thinkers usually use that self-doubt to make it a part of the creative process. Ordinary people, when they doubt themselves, they experience all kinds of fears and doubts. That stops them from being creative. While original thinkers, they use those doubts to improve themselves. So you could say something like that. Finally, he highlights that originals have many bad ideas, but at the same time, they have courage to speak about them to a society. Yeah, this sounds a little bit strange. Speak about them to a society. Maybe you can say they have the courage to openly discuss them, their own failings, and they use their own failings as part of the productive process or something like that. But again, this is a good idea, good supporting idea. In conclusion, he restates the idea, are different from the rest, are not different, and having all the mentioned above weaknesses, they finally succeed. Okay, sure, no problem. I like the summary, just work on the phrasing a little bit and don't use examples.